Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Philip Idle.
Good evening and welcome to sunny California and to LearningSCAPES 2019. Whether you've come from within the state, from across the US, from Canada, from across the pond in Europe or the UK, or hopped across the Pacific from Asia or New Zealand or from my home in Australia, it's an honour to officially welcome you here to this international gathering of learning, together as the Association for Learning Environments. LearningSCAPES this year focuses on how our combined knowledge, accumulated wisdom and collaborative experiences work together to create exemplary learning environments for people all over the world. We gather here in Southern California to explore creativity, curiosity and imagination, three attributes of this area. This is exactly what our association proudly celebrates: professionals who embrace co-creation as it drives the planning, design, construction, teaching pedagogies and operations of our places of learning. Learning environments, whether they be at schools, colleges, universities, early learning centres, technical schools, museums, art galleries or even corporate training centres, provide places for human engagement and stimulating learning. Many of us have been on learning tours over the past 2 days and participated in workshops or learning sessions to begin exploring what co-creation means. Over the next 2 days, we will be challenged by our keynote speakers to think about the intersection of learning and place. And an integral part of this is how design brings these two facets together. To quote tomorrow's keynote speaker, Sarah Williams-Goldhagen, "Discard the notion that design is a discretionary luxury. The built environment affects our physical health and our mental health. It affects our cognitive capabilities and it affects the ways we form and sustain communities." So immerse yourself in the multitude of learning sessions, engage with our many sponsors and vendors, and go away from Anaheim feeling empowered to make a difference. And the opportunity to come together is in no small part because of our wonderful sponsors listed on the screen, rolling on the screen at the moment. The people you will meet in our LE Marketplace have the same passion as each of us for the mission and values of our association, and we thank them for making LearningSCAPES possible for another year. So let's just give them a round of applause, please. And now to this evening's keynote. Stephen Bingler is the founder and CEO of Concordia, a community-centred planning and architectural design practice headquartered in New Orleans. Stephen is also a musician and naturalist, has been published widely and involved in numerous research initiatives, including leading a healthy dialogue among design professionals about the realignment of practice towards greater inclusion and design equity. Joining him on stage this evening is Jess Rimington, a researcher from Stanford University's Global Project Centre, and Jeffrey Vincent, also a researcher from the University of California, Berkeley's Centre for Cities and Schools. Together they're going to set the scene for our conference, What is Co-Creation and Why Would I Want to Do It? Please make them welcome.
Thank you. Well, when John asked me to do a keynote, I thought on co-creation, I thought certainly we have to have more than just one person. So I asked my colleagues here from these universities to join me in this presentation. So the first question that I have of the audience is, how many of you have a partner? A business partner, a personal partner? So that means that you're already an expert on co-creation. Every decision that we make almost every decision that we make with other people. Whether it's a personal decision, whether it's a family decision, a professional decision, we almost never make it by ourselves. So what we're going to be talking about is something that's more about taking that decision-making process to scale. What happens if we can engage more people in a co-creation process? And how can we benefit that? How can the community benefit from having a seat at the table? The term I want to start with is actually a term that I learned in New Orleans. You know, we're blessed in New Orleans with a beautiful Afrocentric culture. You've probably heard of jazz. And jazz bands are really interesting because they involve a lot of different people coming together and riffing off of each other. And that whole concept really comes from a term that is an African term called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu means I am because we are. So that's kind of the theme in some ways of our presentation today. The challenges that we face in school facility planning and frankly also in urban design are that we have dwindling resources. There are a lot of people out there who are saying, sorry, no new taxes. You're going to have to work with what you've got. Find ways to optimize the resources that we now have, or at least optimize the resources that we develop. Another challenging problem or challenge that we have is the whole notion of policy. We have policies that are all developed in silos. So we have school facility planning policies, we had city planning policies, we have library planning policies, we have healthcare planning policies, and for the most part, those policies don't interact with each other. And finally, we are not as good as maybe we would like to be at engaging the whole community in the process. Too many decisions get made behind closed doors in small groups. So what we're going to do is we're going to address those tonight. I'm going to take a shot at the optimizing resources, and then Jeff is going to talk about integrated policy, work that Jeff and I have been talking about now for, what, 15 years we figured out. And then Jess, our colleague from Stanford, is going to talk to us about co-creation. So I'm going to get started with optimization. The key concepts in optimization, I believe, are two. One is called complex systems, complex adaptive systems, and the second one is called emergence. A complex adaptive system is, as you see here from Jay Forrester, who is one of the really key thinkers and one of the grandfathers of the whole concept of complex adaptive thinking. It tells us that complex adaptive systems are really a multiplicity of interacting feedback loops. So a whole bunch of things are connected to each other. We have developed a model for doing that and looking at that as in terms of urban planning or city planning or community planning of any kind that integrates physical planning with social planning, educational planning, cultural planning, organizational planning, and economic planning all at once. So rather than doing educational planning independent of all of these other kinds of planning, the whole notion is let's see if we can integrate all the planning together, and then we'll see what we come up with. And we call that nexus planning, and our way of expressing that relative to the concept of Ubuntu is that it is because everything is. The second concept that I talked about is a concept called emergence. And emergent systems are systems that actually are made up of a number of independent systems, some of which are stupid. But when you put them all together, amazing things can happen if we have these parts communicating with each other. And the best way to describe an emergent system is for me to show you this quick little clip. There's no bird at the front who's telling all the rest of the birds which way to fly. All of these birds are communicating with each other in every moment in real time. Who knows how they do that? But one thing I think we can all agree on is a really beautiful thing to watch. So what happens if we take those two concepts, the concepts of complex adaptive systems, and we take the concept of emergence and we put them together in school facility planning? I'm going to run through a few examples. The first one is a project that we did a number of years ago at the Henry Ford Museum. And this project actually integrates a 400-student school into the Henry Ford Museum. The good news about it is that the kids love it. And they're right in the middle of all these artifacts, and the curators are actually just as important to them as the teachers. And guess what? It costs 25% of what it would have cost to build a regular school. Because the museum was already there. All the exhibits were already heated and cooled. So there's 100% sustainability. And it's a very efficient system, and a system that where all of the kids' learning is integrated through all the artifacts and all the programs in the museum. This is a school that was designed by Bruce Jilk. It's called the School of Environmental Studies. It's at the Minnesota Zoo. And the school is totally integrated into the zoo operations and the zoo facilities. So there again, nobody had to build a school building, or they built a building, but it's a very diminished program as far as the space is concerned. But because they did it together, you get this kind of synergy, right? So the zoo plus the school equals a lot more than a zoo plus a school. Here's another project that Mary Filardo actually organized in Washington, D.C., called the Oyster Adams Bilingual Education Campus, where the school district had a little extra land, but they didn't have any money. Well, there was a real estate developer who had money, but he didn't have any land. So they put their programs together, and the real estate developer built multi-story housing, and the school district built the school, and together they made it work. Ubuntu. I am because we are. This is a school in Swampcott, Massachusetts, actually, that merges a school with a senior center. So imagine if you're in a senior center, you know, what are you going to do all day long? Well, what could you do that would be more interesting than work with kids? And what would be more interesting for the kids than to have all these mentors and not have to pay them, right? And then, so the teachers get all this free assistance, and the seniors get a meaningful life, and everybody wins at a fraction of the cost. That's why we call it optimization. There's a school in the New York Harbor. It uses the boats, it uses the whole mechanism of marine engineering in the New York Harbor, and integrates math, science, language arts, and social studies with that resource. And because when you really cut to the chase, math, science, language arts, and social studies are everywhere. They're not on a PowerPoint presentation in a classroom, or that's not the only place they can be. They're everywhere and all throughout our cities. This is a school in downtown Tampa. It's a magnet school, and the kids go to school in this school, and the whole purpose is that they go out on field trips all around downtown, and they work with merchants, and their curriculum is quite integrated, and also expeditionary, and all the things that we keep hearing about education. What we call those are three examples of individual schools. Imagine what happens if we take an individual school and we merge it with community operations, other community programs that you might find a nonprofit would be building, or a city would be building. Like city is building parks and recreation facilities, districts are building schools, and nonprofit organizations are building social programs. Think about what happens in terms of optimization if we can connect all of those things together. Not only to save money, but provide access to all these programs to the students that need them the most. This is a school in downtown Houston, actually in Gulfton, Houston. There are 90 languages spoken in this neighborhood. This is called the New Ellis Island. The communities of people here are new to this country. They don't speak the language. They don't know how the system works. But some of them were running businesses wherever they came from, but they don't really have access or they don't know how the system works. So when we met with them and we asked them, what would you need to help you, besides of an elementary school, what other things would you need to make your life more meaningful and more helpful? And so they gave us a long list. You know, a health clinic, a business incubator, a tax preparation center because there's all kinds of predatory tax preparation going on, predatory lending going on, so they needed to have a credit union. They wanted to have an arts center because they come from places where the arts are extremely valuable. They wanted a town hall. They wanted a library. So we put all that together, and what we came up with is this Baker Ripley Center, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And we worked with the community to design it. We have murals all over the place that were developed by some of the local artists. This is a project in Emeryville, California. The city council came together with the school district and said, let's work together and let's build a campus where we can have education and the city can do its parks and recreation programs. So all of those programs are there. And yes, we had some complications that we had to work through. Security, right, for example. We have a pre-K to 12 site. So you can imagine some parents were worried about, what about those high school bullies and my little baby? You know, you're going to put them on the same site? And the answer is yes, we are. But we're going to have all kinds of gates and locks and procedures about how this facility is extremely secure during the daytime. But at night and on weekends, it's wide open to the community. So what do you get for that? Well, you get a beautiful campus that's useful 24/7. It's not just useful part of the day. And we did an analysis, or actually we worked with MK Think, our colleagues in San Francisco on this. And they did this analysis to look at every single space and how could it be used 14 hours a day. Because taxpayers only have one wallet. You know, they don't pay taxes to the city and taxes to the school board and taxes to or donations to not-for-profits. It's all of our responsibility to coordinate all this taxpayer money to make sure we get the maximum return on their investment. So we did that here, and it looks like it's working well, and we predicted a 20% savings. The last project I'll show you is the project in Palo Alto, California. We just finished the master plan. It's 555,000 square feet of space on a 43-acre site in downtown Palo Alto. This is another project that's a joint venture between the City of Palo Alto, City Council, and the City Manager of Palo Alto, and the School Superintendent and the School Board of Palo Alto coming together and saying, let's co-develop the site. What do you get for that? Well, if you look at the buildings in red, those are the educational facilities. If you look at the buildings in blue, those are parks and recreation facilities. If you look at the buildings in purple, those are the buildings that are shared between the school district and the city. So those are buildings that only had to be built once, not twice. And I wanted to give a shout out to my friend Monty Hunter, who helped do this calculation for us, that this is an $800 million project, and over the 40 years of its operation, it will save, because of the co-creation process that involved 450 people from the community and an awful lot of hard work in budgeting. This project will actually save taxpayers $425 million over the 40 years of its operation. Now, what is that? That's 124 teacher salaries saved. It's also 367 units of carbon sequestration. So I will tell you, I'm an architect. I get paid to design buildings, but the most efficient and the most important buildings are the ones that we don't build. We don't have to build buildings, only until we need them. So imagine, if you will, that there's a master plan that we did also in New Orleans for school facilities where every single school site was designed to be implemented using this nexus concept. And some of it worked and some of it didn't. And that's why I want to pass the baton over to my friend Jeff, because policy, none of this happens unless policy can back it up. So Jeff, why don't you tell us how it's done?
Thanks, Stephen. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. I came down from Berkeley, which, from those of you who aren't here, is basically directly in from the Golden Gate Bridge. So when you look west from Berkeley, you look right at the Golden Gate Bridge across from San Francisco. What I am interested in, why don't you click to the next one? What I am interested in is how do you scale the kind of examples that Stephen talked about? How do you just make that business as usual? And that's just what we do. And in part, that's the question we formed the Center for Cities and Schools around at the University of California, Berkeley. It's formed in 2004, and we bring urban planners and education policy people together to think about how do we make family-friendly cities that are equitable, that have access to high-quality schools as an absolutely central component of thinking about equality in an equitable city. So we do all kinds of work on transportation as it relates to access to schools, affordable housing as it relates to stability in children's lives, and the place of school, right? The brick and mortar of school. What we're trying to do is bust silos all the time. I myself have been an urban planner, so I'm not a designer or an architect. And what I was asked to do was talk about policy and money on this panel. So you can go to sleep right now. I'm going to be the boring Debbie Downer on this panel. Just a warning, all right? But what I want to do is make 5 observations about this field, which I think is very exciting. I think the work that you do is fascinating and so important to individual children, individual communities, and multiply that by thousands-fold across the countries even that are represented here. So when we look at co-creation, we are, sometimes people call us a think and do tank or an action-oriented policy center, whatever it is. We do a lot of work with high school students, engaging them in real-world urban planning issues, and have client partners that might be cities, they might be school districts, they might be housing developers, et cetera, and bring a youth perspective to whatever that real design choice is. That a design choice has hundreds of millions of dollars potentially behind it in the youth voice. So what we look at in terms of co-creation is both horizontal co-creation and vertical co-creation. What I mean by that is we spend a lot of time with adults in different agencies getting them to work together. So primarily city staff and school district staff. We do project-based learning with adults. How do they work together? And we developed our Plus Leadership Institute to train city and school staff in particular, and sort of the various staff that sort of circumnavigate that in these institutions, how they work together. That's what I consider, or what we consider, kind of horizontal co-creation. And then vertical, doing a lot of work with high school students in particular. How do they work with those adults in that equation? How do the adults actually see the youth and the young people as co-creators, right? And we use community of practice theory to do that, where everyone's bringing something to the table, where everyone's a learner. And this is a picture from about 12 years ago that I grabbed, actually. And this is us working with a professor at Berkeley in landscape architecture, Walter Hood. And I threw it on here because he won the MacArthur Genius Award this week. And so deservedly so. He does amazing design work on integrating the communal history of place into projects, as little as monuments to parks to buildings, et cetera. And I so want him to work more on schools. So look up Walter Hood. But what gets me up in the morning and why I do this work and why we have this center at Berkeley is this. And I'm in the US, so I'm going to talk a lot about the US. And I'm in California, so I do a lot of work in California. I'm going to talk about that. But across this country in particular, we have a lot of this. These are 2 different schools, obviously. And I would argue that we co-created this. And the question we're trying to answer is, how do we recreate that or unco-create that, right? A huge disparity in the place of schools across this country. And so See, I got to get my notes here. All right, so let me jump to my 5 observations. The first observation is the place of school is underfunded and often drastically underfunded. This is some work that some colleagues of mine in Washington, D.C. did. We've been developing methodologies to understand the level of capital funding that's being spent by school districts and states every year, which is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Who's getting it? How much is it relative to the number of square feet that we have? And is that even remotely adequate? And you can see this is on a state level, but looking at benchmarks for minimal spending, only 68% of states are spending enough capital money each year on their schools to maintain what we would call modern standards. And we've done some more drill down on this in California, and we've looked at school district spending on maintenance and operations and school district spending, capital dollar spending by school districts. And this money is coming from local bonds, as well as in California, it comes from state general obligation bonds. And what we found is that only about 40% of school districts each year, over a 5-year average, were meeting minimum standards for yearly M&O investment benchmarks. And we found about the same amount, only 40%, were meeting annual minimum benchmarks for capital spending. So, and we've been monitoring this over the years. We're getting ready to put out a new study with updated numbers on this. The bottom line is we're seeing a chronic underinvestment in this infrastructure. The second observation is that the place of school is often inequitably funded. So what explains that picture I showed you, or those 2 pictures, is, well, in part it does this. We did a big study last year looking at capital spending by the state of California to school districts, and we call capital money to existing school buildings in this state modernization. And so we divided our 1,000 school districts in California by how much money they got over 20 years from the state of California to modernize their school facilities. And these bars are those 5 groups. And the small bar over there, if you look, they got an average of $661 per student over 20 years. The one on my right, the 5th quintile, got an average $5,361 a square foot. And the bars actually represent property values per student in those districts. So what we're seeing is that low wealth districts, school districts serving low wealth communities, really have a disadvantage in accessing both local capital funds and state capital funds. And with colleagues nationally, we've looked at this across the country in the US, and we're seeing this pattern. And the question is, we need to figure out how to remedy it. My third observation is that pre-development is where the co-creation actually happens. But pre-development, I would argue, is so underfunded. And when in the policy conversations I'm in, at least in California particularly, everyone's talking about hard costs. People aren't really talking that much about soft costs. So who in here has led or is leading a community engagement / design process? Has or is? Keep your hand high. Put your hand high. Keep your hand up if you think that process or those processes had anywhere near enough money to do the community engagement that they really should do. My fourth observation is that there's and this is pretty much true in every state in the United States, there's really a state policy vacuum on co-creation. And a great example of this, we've done a lot of looking at what are the standards around planning and design around schools in a lot of the states around the country. And a great example is in that Emeryville project that Stephen pointed to, they felt that they need to get a legislator in the state to run a bill to clarify language in the ed code around joint occupancy of school district-owned land, because it wasn't clear. So they had to change state policy in order to make that happen. My fifth observation is that there's no culture to co-create, I think. And so I'm glad that so many of you are developing it. You know, it's between cities and school districts, different budgets, et cetera, but really what they need are legal teams that don't say no. And we need transactional experts that are creative and willing to manage risk appropriately. So I would say let's co-recreate, because really that's what I see is at the forefront, because at least in California, this is true in all states, enrollment growth has really slowed down. Sure, we'll be building new schools to accommodate stuff, but really what we're going to be doing is modernizing and rebuilding the hundreds and thousands of schools that we already have. And I think that's where it's really exciting. And so I'm eager to watch all you do that, and it's really about the process and how do you build trust. And when I think about recreating, I'm thinking about recreating those places, but I'm also thinking, okay, we need to recreate policies, and we need to recreate investment strategies to make those projects business as usual. And I want to end by making an observation. When I look, often the conversations around this topic, school construction, school capital, even design, I find that those of us in the room look very different than the children and students that we are designing with and for. And I think that's only going to probably increase, although I hope we get more people into design that might not otherwise do it. But I think that's a really interesting challenge, particularly for California, but certainly for the United States. And I would imagine that is a similar story in Australia and other countries that are represented here. So I'm excited to see that change, something we are actively working on, and we invite you to check out our work, and we look forward to partnering with all of you on projects. So with that, I'll turn it over. Okay.
All right. It's the green button. Here we go. Okay. I'm so excited to be speaking with you all. I want to start just first by really thanking you for your work. I've learned a lot just from being kind of through osmosis today, walking around and learning more about your various industries represented here and seeing really that you're at the bleeding edge of building civic muscle. And it's an honor. I'm a researcher and practitioner focused on methodologies and ethics of next economy thinking. And what I mean by that is I spend my time on projects and research that work to transition our towns, cities, and country at large into more resilient, whole, equitable, and life-replenishing systems. And part of that work is the research I co-lead at Stanford University's Global Project Center, where for the past 4 years, we've been organizing an interdisciplinary initiative studying co-creation, studying the how-to of co-creation, processes and projects that really outperform the status quo of their industries because they've chosen to co-create, and really trying to unpack when they achieve that breakout innovation, what's happening. So today I want to talk to you about 3 things. 1, why I think co-creation is so important. 2, to unpack some of that how-to. If you're inspired by this presentation, what's the next step tomorrow if you're interested in incorporating more co-creation into community engagement and planning processes. And 3, I want to co-create with you a bit today before we end. So how does that sound? Nod if you're like, yeah, maybe thumbs down if you're like, I'm really just here for the beverages afterwards outside. Okay, I hear some nodding, that's good. So co-creation is about distributing creative and decision-making authority in a way that's commensurate with the degree to which those actors or stakeholders might be impacted, positively or negatively, by the outcomes of a project or the process of that project itself. It isn't just about consultation or checking the box of having sought input on what one of our interviewees termed as everything but the essentials. I'm sure we all have experience with that check the box kind of consultation in various projects we've seen. To do co-creation versus consultation, it's really an act of stewardship. It's about creating a process that allows for people to advise and make decisions together in a way that their collective wisdom gets to shine through, allowing wiser, smarter, safer, and more resilient outcomes. Outcomes that generally help us be better stewards of place and create better systems that care for all of us. And being in the business of opening up the distribution of creative and decision-making authority means you're also in the business of redistribution, because we're not starting from a place of being in a vacuum. We're also talking about power. So if you're talking about co-creation, you're talking about redistributing power, which is not a small thing. In fact, in our research, we often talk about co-creation as a method for creating a new economic or societal paradigm, that by walking this walk, you invariably create a different world than the one we live in now, brick by brick, school by school, day by day. You're in the business of what Swarthmore professor Dr. Gergen calls world-forming activities. And I bring this up because I think particularly for your work in the world, it's inherently world-forming. And to think about your work as an act of potential co-creation, of a potential co-creative stewardship of place, of learning, it really changes how we might build that civic muscle of this country and the various places folks are from in this room. So I think it's a big responsibility. And I'm biased, but for that reason, I'm really grateful that there's attention at this conference put towards co-creation. When we deny people the creative capacity to be participants in the design and decisions of their places, buildings, programs, and schools, we lose out. We lose out on better solutions. If we're not designing with 100% of the ingenuity possible that we have available, so all of those who will participate in and be affected by a program, service, or project, we lose out. In our research, we looked across fields of urban planning, organizational design, education, public health, high tech, and social movements, and looked for cases where folks used co-creation and ended up with wildly different, refreshing, and wise solutions. And then we tried to see, were there similarities in how they went about that process? We were able to codify the similarities across these different disciplines into 5 practices that were strikingly consistent across the broad diversity of fields in the group. So I want to share those with you today. But before I do, I'd like to do a little bit less of me talking at you and more of being in conversation together. So if you feel comfortable, please close your eyes and put your feet on the floor, whatever they're resting on. And take a few deep breaths. With your eyes still closed, I'd like to ask you to reflect on this question. What was a time in your life where you either felt really empowered or really disempowered to be a decision maker, collaborator, or creator in a process? So once you can imagine that time in your life, with your eyes still closed, what did it feel like? Try to remember the specific feelings as best you can. What emotions did you experience? What sensations did you experience in your body? How did you change or not change from this experience? All right. Take 2 more deep breaths. And when you're ready, open your eyes. All right. And now I'd like to ask you, if you're comfortable, to turn to a person next to you and quickly share about that experience, both people sharing. Ready, set, go. Maybe you can pair up with those people or something. You're okay. Sorry? Oh, shit. Thank you. All right. Thought the mic was off right now. All right, if you haven't shared yet, make sure you share with your partner. I'm going to ask you to wrap up your sharing in 20 seconds, but you can feel free to continue the conversation over drinks later. We're going to go over. I think we're going to go over. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I want to first acknowledge that wasn't a fair experience because I talked more than I've given you time to talk.
That was an underfunded.
That was an de-invested, yes, co-creation experience. But hopefully that gave you a bit of a teaser. Look at all these good conversations going on. All right. Thank you everyone so much for sharing. So, talkative group at the conference. I'm going to keep going. I know, I did start. I'm glad. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for sharing. So I want to dive into these 5 practices pretty quickly. We're going to move at a clip here so we can try to keep mostly to the time of this conference session. So there's 5 practices that we discovered. Okay, here's my green button. There we go. Share power. Prioritize, okay, these have all come as number 1, apologies. Do not do these in order, do them all at the same time. Share power, prioritize relationship, leverage heterogeneity, legitimize all ways of knowing, and prototype early and often. So before I mention a little bit about each of these, I want to note that the research showed that this is all about balance. So you can share too little, as we've probably all experienced with the sharing of power. You can also share too much power. And it's about balancing these components in your co-creation processes and really finding that point of equanimity. So let's talk about sharing power first. While many processes ask stakeholders to provide input, relatively few ask stakeholders to share power. Sharing power means distributing the functions of decision-making, creation, implementation, and evaluation amongst the process participants, and dissolving the supposed boundaries between designer and consumer, as well as expert and beneficiary. Insights are dramatically deepened when power is shared so that participants are not merely inquiry subjects, but also engaged as analysts and decision makers. So for instance, this has not happened, but if Uber as a company said something like, hey, drivers, we'd like to both have your insights on how to make the app better, and we're going to commensurately give you decision-making authority on how those inputs are going to be utilized in the app. That would be an example of sharing power rather than sharing input. Perhaps actually a lot easier to do in some of the processes that you all are involved in that are community and place-based than a national app. Some ways you can think about sharing power is defining the problem at hand with others involved, trusting all the players with the full information about the big picture and your constraints, supporting authentic leadership roles and structures for participants with the possibility of them to play multiple roles. All right, prioritizing relationship. So I'm sure it's not news to you that relationships are probably your organization's greatest asset. One key to building and sustaining strong relationships and co-creative processes is to establish a fair deal, or what we like to talk about as a co-commitment. And one of the most important factors in motivating people to take part in co-creation processes is for them to really feel like the process is fair. They understand what's being asked of them, they understand the time commitment, maybe they've had the ability to decide around some of those design constraints. They know how their insights will be used. There's some sort of reciprocity structure, and that all of that is decided together through a co-commitment process. We found that when that happens, you retain people through a co-creation process and you get much stronger insights. Another thing to keep in mind is when you ask participants to offer ideas or to interact in a way that is not primarily transactional and does not prioritize that does prioritize relationship purely for its own sake, purely just for the sake of getting to know each other, which can be a really hard concept sometimes in time stress scenarios, resource stress scenarios. But if you invite people into a process where they really feel honored that the relationship dynamic exists outside of the transaction and what needs to be accomplished, ironically, even though we're talking about non-transaction, you build better systems, you garner better insights, more collective wisdom emerges. So one quick participatory thing, if you want to break out your phone or something to write with, and I want you to write down or type the name of one person you met here at this conference so far that you'd love to grab coffee with at some time. Maybe it will be virtually if you don't live in the same city, but someone you just really would love to chat with. So someone you've met today since you arrived that you'd like to talk with more. All right, so here's the test. Look at the name or description you wrote down. Do you want to connect with that person for any professional networking reasons? As a transaction or as a means to an end? If so, that's totally fine. That's certainly a great thing to do. But if you thought yes to that, I want you to think of someone else you also met at this conference that you just feel like, I just want to be their friend. They make me smile. I just want to learn more about them. I just want to hang out. They make me feel good about myself or about what they're creating in the world. And write down the name of that person. Or think it in your head. And it's totally up to you if you'd like to take this challenge. But before you leave this conference, I'd like to dare you to go up and make contact with that person just on that relationship basis, not on the transaction basis. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about prioritizing relationship in that way through co-creation. So the last three I'll skim through really fast. So leverage heterogeneity. Diversity is such a buzzword these days. Most efforts now acknowledge that the need for heterogeneity in both the makeup of organizations and the people we work with. But few go beyond the superficial kind of check-the-box inclusion efforts, often associated with diversity. And research demonstrates that if you don't build your whole system to best be able to work in collaboration with various types of diversity, it's really a liability to the project. All right. The fourth practice is one of my favorites. Legitimize all ways of knowing. And it can be challenging for many people to accept that all types of knowledge are legitimate. Most processes heavily privilege knowledge that reflects academic or technical training. So it's important to actively build projects that source knowledge in other ways. There's a growing acceptance that non-formal knowledge, as well as the importance of unconscious or intuitive and embodied insights, is important. This is something that many cultures around our world have known for a very long time, and we're starting to see the science behind it. So building processes that leverage and allow for the whole picture of knowledge to come in leads to better breakout innovation within co-creation. And the last is prototype early and often. So prototype is just a draft idea or a mock-up. Oh, I think there's a mariachi band coming in.
Yes, we're going to need to wrap up a little bit.
All right. So the ability to prototype early and often is to share an idea before you're fully ready for it to be acknowledged. And to be able to open it up to all the participants in a process and see what do they think should change so you can get to better co-creative results. So I'm going to pass to Stephen to close us out, and thank you so much.
All I want to do is to thank everybody for listening. Oops. Now, can you hear me? I'm on? Yeah. I want to thank everybody for coming here tonight, and I especially want to thank everybody for embracing in this conference this whole notion of engagement. I mean, it's, there's one word for it. It's called democracy. And we haven't quite figured it out yet. No surprise, it's only been a couple of 100 years, right? So with a lot of work and a lot of diligence and a lot of collaboration and co-creation, I think, we can get closer to the kinds of things that Jeff talked about, the kind of equity, the kind of respect. And by the way, we can probably do it for a lot less cost. So let's get after it. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, a big hand for Stephen Bingler and company and their super session. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get started with our awards ceremony. But first, what we need you to do is we need you to go out into the foyer and enjoy a glass of wine or a beer. So we got wine and beer out in the foyer and our mariachi. So please, we'll see you here in just a little bit. There's also a little nosh out there as well.
I'll see you